Marcus Chen had always been the kind of guy who thought he could talk his way out of anything. At 32 years old, he ran a successful car dealership in San Diego, drove a luxury vehicle, and wore expensive watches that caught everyone's attention. He had built his reputation on being tough, aggressive, and never backing down from anyone. In his mind, respect came from intimidation, and he made sure everyone around him knew it. The evening started like any other Friday night. Marcus was at the Harbor Grill, a popular restaurant near the marina where business people and locals gathered after work. He sat at the bar with two of his salesmen, drinking whiskey and talking loudly about a deal he had just closed. The place was packed, and the noise level was high, but Marcus always made sure his voice carried above everyone else's. That's when he noticed the man sitting 3 seats down from him. The guy was quiet, drinking water, and seemed completely uninterested in the chaos around him. He looked to be in his late 30s with short brown hair and a calm demeanor that Marcus found irritating. There was something about people who seemed too calm that bothered Marcus. He saw it as weakness. Marcus nudged one of his salesmen and nodded toward the quiet man. He made a joke loud enough for others to hear about people who came to bars and didn't drink. His salesman laughed nervously, but the man at the bar didn't react at all. He simply continued looking at his phone, completely unbothered. This lack of response annoyed Marcus even more. He was used to getting reactions from people, whether it was laughter, fear, or anger. But this guy acted like Marcus didn't even exist. So Marcus decided to push a little harder. He called out to the bartender, making another comment about how some people didn't know how to have a good time. Still, the man didn't look up. The bartender, a woman named Sarah who had worked there for years, gave Marcus a warning look. She had seen him cause problems before, and she didn't want any trouble tonight. But Marcus ignored her. He stood up from his stool and walked closer to the quiet man, his expensive shoes clicking on the wooden floor. When Marcus was right next to him, he put his hand on the bar and leaned in. He asked the man if he had a problem with people having fun. The question hung in the air for a moment. The other people at the bar had started to notice what was happening, and conversations began to die down. Everyone could feel the tension building. The man finally looked up from his phone. His eyes were steady and clear, showing no sign of anger or fear. He simply said that he didn't have any problem at all, and that he hoped Marcus enjoyed his evening. Then he went back to looking at his phone. His voice was polite but firm, the kind of tone that suggested he had dealt with difficult people before and wasn't impressed. This response made Marcus furious. In his world, when someone challenged you, you either fought back or showed fear. This man was doing neither. He was treating Marcus like he was nothing more than a minor annoyance, like a fly buzzing around that wasn't worth the effort to swat away. Marcus felt his face getting hot and his hands clenched into fists. He moved even closer, invading the man's personal space. Marcus told him that maybe he should leave if he couldn't handle being around real men. He threw in a few insults about the man's clothes, his drink choice, and the fact that he was sitting alone. Marcus's salesmen watched nervously from their seats, knowing their boss was crossing a line but too afraid to intervene. The man set his phone down on the bar and turned to face Marcus fully. He took a slow breath, and for the first time, Marcus saw something in his eyes that made him pause. It wasn't anger or fear. It was evaluation. The man was sizing Marcus up, calculating something in his head. It was the look of someone who had been trained to assess threats quickly and efficiently, but Marcus was too far gone to recognize the warning signs. His ego had taken over completely. He moved even closer, his chest nearly touching the other man's shoulder. He demanded to know what the guy was going to do about it. Was he going to sit there like a coward? Or was he going to step outside and settle this like a man? Marcus's voice had risen to a shout now, and the entire restaurant had gone quiet. The man stood up slowly. He was about the same height as Marcus, but moved with a controlled grace that Marcus didn't possess. He said clearly and calmly that he didn't want any trouble, and that it would be better if Marcus just went back to his friends. There was no challenge in his voice, no mockery, just a simple statement of fact. This only made Marcus angrier. He saw it as cowardice, as someone trying to avoid a fight because they knew they would lose. Marcus grabbed the man's shirt, pulling him closer. He told him that nobody disrespected Marcus Chen and got away with it. He said that he had connections all over this city, that he could make this guy's life very difficult if he wanted to. What happened next was so fast that Marcus barely registered it. The man's hand came up and gently but firmly removed Marcus's grip from his shirt. The movement was professional, practiced, and completely effortless. Marcus tried to grab him again but found his wrist caught in a grip that felt like iron. The man held Marcus's wrist without squeezing hard, but Marcus suddenly couldn't move it at all. The man leaned in slightly and spoke in a low voice that only Marcus could hear. He said that Marcus should really walk away now, while he still could. That this wasn't going to end the way Marcus thought it would. That Marcus was making a very serious mistake. The words were said without emotion, just a simple warning delivered by someone who clearly knew what he was talking about. But Marcus's pride wouldn't let him back down, especially not in front of all these people. He tried to pull his wrist free and threw a wild punch with his other hand. The man moved his head slightly to the side and Marcus's fist hit nothing but air. Before Marcus could recover his balance, he felt his arm being guided firmly to his side. And suddenly he was facing the bar with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that wasn't quite painful, but made it very clear he was completely controlled. The whole thing had taken maybe 3 seconds. Marcus Chen had always been the kind of guy who thought he could talk his way out of anything. At 32 years old, he ran a successful car dealership in San Diego, drove a luxury vehicle, and wore expensive watches that caught everyone's attention. He had built his reputation on being tough, aggressive, and never backing down from anyone. In his mind, respect came from intimidation, and he made sure everyone around him knew it. The evening started like any other Friday night. Marcus was at the Harbor Grill, a popular restaurant near the marina where business people and locals gathered after work. He sat at the bar with 2 of his salesmen, drinking whiskey and talking loudly about a deal he had just closed. The place was packed, and the noise level was high, but Marcus always made sure his voice carried above everyone else's. That's when he noticed the man sitting 3 seats down from him. The guy was quiet, drinking water, and seemed completely uninterested in the chaos around him. He looked to be in his late 30s with short brown hair and a calm demeanor that Marcus found irritating. There was something about people who seemed too calm that bothered Marcus. He saw it as weakness. Marcus nudged one of his salesmen and nodded toward the quiet man. He made a joke loud enough for others to hear about people who came to bars and didn't drink. His salesman laughed nervously, but the man at the bar didn't react at all. He simply continued looking at his phone, completely unbothered. This lack of response annoyed Marcus even more. He was used to getting reactions from people, whether it was laughter, fear, or anger. But this guy acted like Marcus didn't even exist. So Marcus decided to push a little harder. He called out to the bartender, making another comment about how some people didn't know how to have a good time. Still, the man didn't look up. The bartender, a woman named Sarah who had worked there for years, gave Marcus a warning look. She had seen him cause problems before, and she didn't want any trouble tonight. But Marcus ignored her. He stood up from his stool and walked closer to the quiet man, his expensive shoes clicking on the wooden floor. When Marcus was right next to him, he put his hand on the bar and leaned in. He asked the man if he had a problem with people having fun. The question hung in the air for a moment. The other people at the bar had started to notice what was happening, and conversations began to die down. Everyone could feel the tension building. The man finally looked up from his phone. His eyes were steady and clear, showing no sign of anger or fear. He simply said that he didn't have any problem at all, and that he hoped Marcus enjoyed his evening. Then he went back to looking at his phone. His voice was polite but firm, the kind of tone that suggested he had dealt with difficult people before and wasn't impressed. This response made Marcus furious. In his world, when someone challenged you, you either fought back or showed fear. This man was doing neither. He was treating Marcus like he was nothing more than a minor annoyance, like a fly buzzing around that wasn't worth the effort to swat away. Marcus felt his face getting hot and his hands clenched into fists. He moved even closer, invading the man's personal space. Marcus told him that maybe he should leave if he couldn't handle being around real men. He threw in a few insults about the man's clothes, his drink choice, and the fact that he was sitting alone. Marcus's salesmen watched nervously from their seats, knowing their boss was crossing a line but too afraid to intervene. The man set his phone down on the bar and turned to face Marcus fully. He took a slow breath, and for the first time, Marcus saw something in his eyes that made him pause. It wasn't anger or fear. It was evaluation. The man was sizing Marcus up, calculating something in his head. It was the look of someone who had been trained to assess threats quickly and efficiently, but Marcus was too far gone to recognize the warning signs. His ego had taken over completely. He moved even closer, his chest nearly touching the other man's shoulder. He demanded to know what the guy was going to do about it. Was he going to sit there like a coward? Or was he going to step outside and settle this like a man? Marcus's voice had risen to a shout now, and the entire restaurant had gone quiet. The man stood up slowly. He was about the same height as Marcus, but moved with a controlled grace that Marcus didn't possess. He said clearly and calmly that he didn't want any trouble, and that it would be better if Marcus just went back to his friends. There was no challenge in his voice, no mockery, just a simple statement of fact. This only made Marcus angrier. He saw it as cowardice, as someone trying to avoid a fight because they knew they would lose. Marcus grabbed the man's shirt, pulling him closer. He told him that nobody disrespected Marcus Chen and got away with it. He said that he had connections all over this city, that he could make this guy's life very difficult if he wanted to. What happened next was so fast that Marcus barely registered it. The man's hand came up and gently but firmly removed Marcus's grip from his shirt. The movement was professional, practiced, and completely effortless. Marcus tried to grab him again but found his wrist caught in a grip that felt like iron. The man held Marcus's wrist without squeezing hard, but Marcus suddenly couldn't move it at all. The man leaned in slightly and spoke in a low voice that only Marcus could hear. He said that Marcus should really walk away now, while he still could, that this wasn't going to end the way Marcus thought it would, that Marcus was making a very serious mistake. The words were said without emotion, just a simple warning delivered by someone who clearly knew what he was talking about. But Marcus's pride wouldn't let him back down, especially not in front of all these people. He tried to pull his wrist free and threw a wild punch with his other hand. The man moved his head slightly to the side and Marcus's fist hit nothing but air. Before Marcus could recover his balance, he felt his arm being guided firmly to his side. And suddenly he was facing the bar with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that wasn't quite painful, but made it very clear he was completely controlled. The whole thing had taken maybe 3 seconds. Marcus barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of everyone in that restaurant watching him get controlled like a child throwing a tantrum. He saw the phone screens recording his humiliation. By 3 a.m, he gave up on sleep and grabbed his laptop, knowing what he was going to find but unable to stop himself from looking. Sure enough, videos of the incident were already spreading across social media. Someone had titled it, "Businessman Gets Handled by Navy SEAL," and it had already received thousands of views. The comments were brutal. People called him a bully, a coward, and worse. Many praised Jake for his restraint and professionalism. Some people even recognized Marcus from his car dealership commercials, and they were sharing the video specifically because of that recognition. Marcus felt his stomach turn as he read comment after comment mocking him. His business, his reputation, everything he had built through years of aggressive salesmanship and intimidation tactics was being torn apart in real time by complete strangers on the internet. Several comments mentioned that they would never buy a car from someone who acted that way. Others were tagging the dealership's official social media pages. By 6 a.m, Marcus's phone started ringing. His business partner David was calling. Marcus let it go to voicemail. Then his marketing director called. Then his sales manager. He ignored them all. He knew what they wanted to talk about and he wasn't ready to face it yet. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, drinking coffee and scrolling through the increasingly viral videos of his worst moment. Around 8 o'clock, someone knocked on his door. Marcus considered not answering, but the knocking persisted. He finally opened it to find David standing there, looking exhausted and angry. David pushed past Marcus into the house without waiting for an invitation. He held up his phone, showing the video that had now been picked up by local news sites. David didn't yell, which somehow made it worse. He simply asked Marcus what he had been thinking. The dealership's phone lines had been flooded with calls since early morning. Some customers were canceling their orders. Others were leaving negative reviews online, specifically mentioning the video. The dealership's social media pages were being bombarded with comments. Their reputation was taking serious damage. Marcus tried to explain to minimize what had happened, but David cut him off. He pointed out that Marcus had attacked a Navy SEAL in a room full of witnesses while drunk. There was no explanation that would make that acceptable. No amount of spin could turn Marcus into the victim of this story. David said that the board of directors was meeting tomorrow morning, and Marcus needed to be prepared for serious consequences. After David left, Marcus forced himself to shower and get dressed. He knew he needed to do something, anything, to try to control the damage. He called his lawyer, a man named Richard who had handled various business matters for him over the years. Richard answered on the first ring, and Marcus could tell from his tone that he had already seen the videos. Richard was blunt. He explained that Marcus had no legal case whatsoever against Jake Sullivan. In fact, Marcus was fortunate that Jake had chosen not to press charges, because the evidence clearly showed Marcus as the aggressor. Richard advised Marcus to stay completely silent on social media, avoid any further contact with Jake, and prepare a public apology. He emphasized that the only way forward was to take full responsibility and show genuine remorse. Marcus hated that advice. Apologizing felt like admitting defeat, like confirming that he was wrong. But he also knew Richard was right. He spent the next several hours drafting and redrafting an apology statement. Everything he wrote sounded fake or defensive. He couldn't find the right words because deep down, he was still more upset about being humiliated than about his actual behavior. That afternoon, his phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Jennifer Marks, a reporter from a local news station. She said they were running a story about the incident at the Harbor Grill and wanted to give Marcus an opportunity to comment. She asked if he would agree to an interview. Marcus's first instinct was to refuse, but something made him pause. Maybe an interview would give him a chance to tell his side of the story, to show people that he wasn't the villain everyone was making him out to be. He agreed to meet Jennifer the next day at a neutral location. After hanging up, he immediately regretted the decision but felt trapped by his agreement. That evening, Marcus did something he rarely did. He drove back to the Harbor Grill. He wasn't sure why exactly. Maybe he wanted to see if Jake was there. Maybe he wanted to apologize in person. Maybe he just needed to face the scene of his humiliation. Whatever the reason, he found himself parking in the same lot where Officer Rodriguez had told him about Jake's military service. Inside the restaurant, Sarah, the bartender, saw him immediately. Her expression was guarded, and Marcus noticed her hand move toward the phone. He raised his hands in a peaceful gesture and approached the bar slowly. He asked if Jake Sullivan had been back since that night. Sarah studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. She said Jake had left town the next morning, heading back to his base in Virginia. Marcus felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. He had wanted to apologize, but he was also glad he didn't have to face Jake again so soon. He asked Sarah if she knew how to contact Jake, maybe an email or phone number. Sarah said she didn't have that information, and even if she did, she wouldn't give it out. She suggested that if Marcus really wanted to make things right, he should focus on changing his behavior rather than seeking forgiveness. Those words hit harder than Marcus expected. Sarah wasn't being cruel or vindictive. She was simply stating an obvious truth that Marcus had been avoiding. He thanked her and left the restaurant, feeling more lost than he had felt in years. On the drive home, he thought about her words. Focus on changing his behavior. That implied that his behavior needed changing, that who he had been for the past several years was fundamentally wrong. The next morning, Marcus met Jennifer Marks at a coffee shop downtown. She had a camera operator with her and a list of prepared questions. As soon as they sat down and started the interview, Marcus knew he had made a terrible mistake. Jennifer's questions were fair but pointed. She asked him why he had initiated the confrontation, what he had hoped to achieve, whether he regularly behaved that way, how he felt about attacking a service member who had been defending the country. Marcus tried to stick to the apology script he had prepared, but Jennifer pushed back on every vague statement. She asked for specifics. She wanted to know what exactly he was apologizing for, what he was learning from this experience, how he planned to change. Marcus found himself stuttering and backtracking, unable to provide satisfactory answers because he hadn't truly processed any of those questions himself. The interview lasted 30 minutes but felt like hours. When it was over, Marcus knew it had gone poorly. Jennifer thanked him professionally and said the segment would air that evening. Marcus went home and spent the rest of the day dreading what he knew was coming. He had tried to rehabilitate his image and had only made things worse by showing that he didn't really understand why his actions were wrong. The news segment aired at 6 o'clock that evening. Marcus forced himself to watch it. Sitting alone in his living room with the curtains drawn, Jennifer Marks introduced the story with clips from the viral video, then transitioned to her interview with him. Watching himself on screen was painful. He looked defensive, arrogant even while trying to apologize. His body language was all wrong. Every answer he gave sounded rehearsed and insincere. But what really shocked Marcus was the second half of the segment. Jennifer had somehow tracked down Jake Sullivan and conducted a phone interview with him. Jake's voice was calm and measured as he explained what had happened that night. He didn't attack Marcus or call him names. Instead, Jake talked about how conflict de-escalation was part of his training, and how he always tried to resolve situations without violence when possible. He said he hoped Marcus would learn from the experience and become a better person because of it. The contrast between Jake's composed, thoughtful responses and Marcus's defensive stammering was devastating. Jake came across as mature, professional, and genuinely concerned about Marcus's well-being. Marcus came across as everything people already thought he was based on the original video. When the segment ended, Marcus turned off the television and sat in silence. Jake had managed to make him look even worse simply by being gracious and forgiving. The next morning, Marcus attended the emergency board meeting at the dealership. The conference room felt cold and hostile as he walked in. David sat at the head of the table with 3 other board members, all of whom looked grim. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. David pulled up analytics showing the dealership's online reputation scores, which had plummeted. He showed screenshots of canceled orders and angry customer emails. The damage was quantifiable and significant. One of the board members, an older woman named Patricia, spoke first. She said that Marcus's actions had jeopardized everything they had built together. The dealership employed over 40 people whose livelihoods now hung in the balance, because Marcus couldn't control his ego for one evening. She asked him directly what he planned to do to fix this situation. Marcus had prepared another apology, but looking at their faces, he realized words wouldn't be enough. David proposed a solution that made Marcus's blood run cold. He suggested that Marcus take an immediate leave of absence from all public-facing roles at the dealership. Marcus would retain his ownership stake, but someone else would become the face of the business while things settled down. Additionally, David recommended that Marcus seek professional help, specifically anger management counseling and therapy, to address whatever issues had led to that night's behavior. Marcus wanted to argue, to fight back against what felt like an attack on his character, but he looked around the table and saw no sympathy, no allies. These people weren't his enemies. They were his business partners trying to save something he had put at risk. So instead of arguing, Marcus did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He agreed to everything they proposed without condition. The meeting ended shortly after that. As people filed out of the conference room, Patricia stopped Marcus at the door. She told him that she actually respected his decision to accept their terms. She said it showed more maturity than she had expected from him based on recent events. She also mentioned that her brother was a Marine veteran, and watching that video of Marcus attacking Jake had made her physically angry. But she believed people could change if they truly wanted to. She hoped Marcus truly wanted to change. That afternoon, Marcus began making phone calls to find a therapist who specialized in anger management and behavioral issues. The process was humbling. He had to explain to multiple receptionists why he needed help, and several had already seen the video. One receptionist recognized his name immediately and said the practice wasn't accepting new clients, though Marcus suspected that wasn't entirely true. Finally, he found a therapist named Dr. Helen Moss who had an opening the following week. The days between that meeting and his first therapy appointment were among the longest of Marcus's life. He stayed home mostly, avoiding public places where he might be recognized. His social media accounts were still being flooded with comments, so he stopped looking at them entirely. Friends who he thought were close stopped calling or texting. Marcus realized that many of his relationships had been built on his status and success, rather than genuine connection. His first session with Dr. Moss was uncomfortable. She had him describe the incident in detail, but she kept stopping him to ask about his thoughts and feelings in specific moments. Why had Jake's calmness bothered him so much? What had he hoped to gain by confronting someone who was just sitting quietly? What did respect mean to him? And why did he feel entitled to it from strangers? The questions forced Marcus to confront motivations. He had never examined before. Dr. Moss explained that Marcus displayed classic signs of someone who had built their identity around external validation and dominance. She suggested that underneath his aggressive behavior was deep insecurity and fear of being seen as weak or insignificant. Marcus initially resisted this diagnosis. He insisted that he was confident and successful, not insecure. But as the session continued, Dr. Moss gently pointed out examples from his own story that contradicted his self-image. By the end of that first session, Marcus felt exhausted but also strangely relieved. Someone was finally addressing the real issues instead of just condemning his actions. Dr. Moss gave him homework. She wanted him to journal every day about moments when he felt the urge to dominate or intimidate someone, and to explore where those urges came from. She also wanted him to practice mindfulness exercises to help him pause before reacting to perceived slights. Marcus committed to the homework more seriously than he had committed to anything in years. He began carrying a small notebook everywhere, writing down his thoughts and reactions throughout the day. What he discovered surprised him. He realized he felt threatened by competence in others, by people who seemed comfortable in their own skin without needing to prove anything. Jake had represented everything Marcus secretly feared he wasn't, which was why Jake's calmness had enraged him so much. 3 weeks into therapy, Marcus received an unexpected email. It was from a veterans organization in San Diego that worked with returning service members to help them transition back to civilian life. The director of the organization, a retired Army colonel named Michael Torres, had seen the news coverage of the incident. Rather than condemning Marcus, Michael was writing to offer him an opportunity to volunteer with the organization. Michael explained in his email that many veterans struggled with civilians who didn't understand military culture or the sacrifices service members made. He thought that Marcus, having learned a very public lesson about respecting veterans, might be able to help bridge that gap. He invited Marcus to come to their next orientation session and learn about what the organization did. There was no pressure, just an invitation to turn a negative experience into something positive. Marcus read the email 3 times, looking for hidden judgment or mockery. But the tone seemed genuine. He brought the email to his next therapy session, and Dr. Moss encouraged him to accept the invitation. She said that making amends wasn't just about apologizing, but about taking action to become better. Volunteering with veterans would force Marcus to confront his preconceptions and potentially develop real empathy for people he had previously seen as threats to his ego. The following Tuesday evening, Marcus attended his first orientation at the Veterans Center. The building was modest, located in a strip mall between a laundromat and a phone repair shop. Inside, about 15 people sat in a circle of folding chairs. Some were veterans themselves. Others were volunteers from the community. Michael Torres welcomed Marcus without making a big deal of who he was or why he was there, for which Marcus was grateful. The orientation session opened Marcus's eyes to a world he had never considered before. Michael Torres explained that many veterans returned home with invisible wounds that were just as serious as physical injuries. They struggled to find employment, to reconnect with families, to adapt to a society that didn't understand what they had experienced. The organization provided job training, counseling referrals, housing assistance, and most importantly, a community of people who understood what they were going through. As different veterans shared their stories during the orientation, Marcus felt increasingly small and ashamed. A young Marine named Carlos talked about coming home from Afghanistan and not being able to sleep because every loud noise made him reach for a weapon that wasn't there. A Navy veteran named Angela described the challenge of explaining to potential employers that her military experience as a logistics specialist was actually valuable in civilian supply chain management. An Army sergeant named Robert spoke about losing 3 friends in Iraq and carrying that guilt every single day. These were real problems, serious struggles that put Marcus's ego-driven confrontation with Jake into sharp perspective. He had been so focused on being respected and feared that he had never stopped to consider what actual sacrifice and service looked like. The veterans in this room had given years of their lives to protect people like Marcus, and many of them had returned to face challenges that Marcus couldn't begin to imagine. After the orientation, Several volunteers stayed to help prepare care packages for newly transitioning veterans. Marcus joined them at a long table covered with toiletries, snacks, and welcome letters. He worked alongside a college student named Emma, who had been volunteering for 6 months. She chatted easily with the veterans who came in and out of the room, asking about their families and remembering details from previous conversations. Marcus realized this was what genuine respect looked like. Not fear or intimidation, but authentic interest in other people's well-being. Michael Torres approached Marcus as he was packing his third care box. Michael thanked him for coming and asked if he might be interested in volunteering regularly. Marcus surprised himself by saying yes immediately. Michael smiled and said they could use someone with business experience to help veterans with resume writing and interview preparation. Many service members had incredible skills but didn't know how to translate them into civilian job applications. Marcus had never thought of his business knowledge as something that could help others, but the idea appealed to him. Over the next 2 months, Marcus became a regular presence at the Veterans Center. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, he met with former service members to review their resumes and practice interview techniques. The work was challenging in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. He had to learn to listen rather than lecture, to ask questions rather than make assumptions, to recognize that his way wasn't the only way to approach problems. One evening, Marcus was working with a former Army medic named James, who was applying for positions as a paramedic. James had saved lives under fire in hostile territory, but his resume made him sound like a basic first aid provider. Marcus helped him reframe his experience, highlighting his ability to perform under extreme pressure, his leadership in training junior medics, and his expertise in trauma care. When they finished the revised resume, James looked at it with something like wonder. He said he had never thought about his military service having value in the civilian world. That comment stuck with Marcus for days. How many veterans felt that way? How many people like Jake Sullivan had skills and experiences that civilians like Marcus completely undervalued? Marcus brought this question to his next therapy session, and Dr. Moss used it to explore how Marcus was beginning to develop empathy. She pointed out that a few months ago, Marcus had only thought about how other people could serve his needs or threaten his status. Now he was considering things from other people's perspectives. The progress was real but not linear. Marcus still had moments of frustration when his old habits surfaced. One afternoon at the dealership where he was slowly resuming some behind-the-scenes responsibilities, a customer became angry about a billing error. Marcus felt the familiar urge to dominate the situation, to put the customer in their place. But he caught himself, took a breath, and instead listened to the man's concerns. The situation was resolved calmly and professionally, leaving both parties satisfied. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. Around this time, Marcus received another unexpected message. This one came through the Veterans Center, forwarded by Michael Torres. It was from Jake Sullivan. The email was brief and straightforward. Jake said he had heard from Michael about Marcus's volunteer work and wanted to acknowledge that taking responsibility and making changes was harder than most people realized. Jake wrote that he respected Marcus's efforts and hoped they continued. He signed it simply with his name. Marcus read the email multiple times, searching for sarcasm or judgment but finding none. Jake was offering genuine encouragement, even after everything Marcus had done. Marcus wanted to respond immediately but stopped himself. What could he possibly say that would mean anything? Instead, he saved the email and showed it to Dr. Moss at their next session. She asked him how it made him feel. Marcus struggled to put it into words, finally settling on undeserving. He felt like he didn't deserve Jake's kindness after his behavior. Dr. Moss gently suggested that maybe accepting kindness even when feeling undeserving was part of growth. She explained that many people struggled with receiving forgiveness because it required them to sit with their shame and guilt, rather than trying to earn their way out of it. Jake wasn't asking Marcus to prove himself. He was simply acknowledging Marcus's efforts without expecting anything in return. That was grace, and grace was often uncomfortable to receive. That weekend, Marcus did something he hadn't done since high school. He attended a workshop on conflict resolution at the community college. The workshop was designed for volunteers who worked with at-risk youth, but Michael had suggested it might be useful for Marcus's work at the Veterans Center. The facilitator, a social worker named Linda, taught techniques for de-escalating tense situations and communicating without aggression. Marcus took pages of notes, recognizing that these were skills he should have learned decades ago. During one exercise, participants paired up to practice active listening. Marcus was partnered with a young woman named Sophia, who worked at a youth homeless shelter. She shared a story about a teenager who had become violent during an intake process, and how the shelter staff had managed to calm him down without calling police. Marcus listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and realized how similar the situation was to what Jake had done with him at the restaurant. Jake could have escalated. He could have responded with violence. Instead, he had used the minimum force necessary and showed restraint. When it was Marcus's turn to share, he found himself telling Sophia about the incident at the Harbor Grill. He had avoided talking about it with anyone except Dr. Moss, but something about the safe environment of the workshop made him open up. Sophia listened without judgment, nodding occasionally. When he finished, she said something that struck him deeply. She told him that admitting mistakes publicly took more courage than most people had, and that the teenagers she worked with needed to see examples of adults who could acknowledge when they were wrong and actually change. The workshop ended with Linda leading a discussion about accountability versus shame. She explained that shame made people defensive and resistant to change, while accountability acknowledged wrongdoing, but focused on future improvement. Marcus realized he had been stuck in shame for weeks, punishing himself mentally for his actions. But Jake's email, the Veterans Center work, and now this workshop were all pointing toward accountability instead. The question wasn't whether Marcus was a bad person. The question was what kind of person he chose to become moving forward. That night, Marcus finally responded to Jake's email. He kept it short and honest. He thanked Jake for his message and acknowledged that he was trying to learn from their encounter. He mentioned his volunteer work at the Veterans Center, not to impress Jake, but to show that he was taking concrete steps to change. He ended by saying that Jake's restraint that night had probably saved Marcus from much worse consequences, and he was grateful for that restraint even though it had been humiliating at the time. Marcus hit send before he could overthink the message. He didn't expect a response, and he told himself he didn't need one. The email was about taking responsibility, not seeking validation. But 2 days later, Jake replied. His message was longer this time. He wrote about his own journey in the military, about learning that real strength wasn't about dominating others, but about protecting them. He shared that he had seen too many young service members confuse aggression with leadership, and it always ended badly for them and everyone around them. Jake also wrote about the importance of mentorship and community. He said the work Marcus was doing at the Veterans Center mattered more than Marcus probably realized. Many veterans came home feeling invisible or misunderstood, and having someone from the business. 8 months after the incident at the Harbor Grill, Marcus stood in front of a room full of people at a veterans employment fair. Michael Torres had asked him to speak on a panel about hiring veterans, alongside representatives from several major companies. Marcus had initially declined, uncomfortable with public speaking after months of keeping a low profile. But Michael had been persistent, arguing that Marcus's perspective as someone who had learned to truly value veterans' contributions would be powerful. The moderator asked Marcus a question about what skills veterans brought to civilian workplaces. Marcus took a breath and spoke honestly. He talked about discipline, leadership, adaptability, and the ability to perform under pressure. But then he went further. He admitted that he hadn't always recognized these qualities in veterans. He briefly mentioned his encounter with Jake Sullivan, not dwelling on the details but acknowledging it as a wake-up call about his own biases and behavior. He explained that working with veterans over the past several months had taught him that military service developed exactly the kind of character and competence that every business needed. The veterans he had met showed more integrity, work ethic, and genuine humility than many successful business people he knew. He said that any employer who overlooked veteran candidates was making a serious mistake, missing out on some of the finest employees they could ever hope to find. The audience responded with sustained applause. After the panel ended, several business owners approached Marcus to ask about starting their own veteran hiring initiatives. Marcus exchanged contact information with them and promised to connect them with resources from the Veterans Center. He realized that his network, which he had once used primarily for self-promotion, could actually serve a meaningful purpose by connecting veterans with employment opportunities. That evening, Marcus received a text message from an unknown number. The message said simply, "Saw your panel speech online, well done. Stay the course." It was signed with the initials JS. Marcus stared at his phone, a mix of emotions washing over him. Jake had been watching, had taken the time to send encouragement. Marcus saved the message and responded with a simple thank you, adding that he hoped they might meet again someday under better circumstances. The next morning, Marcus had his regular therapy session with Dr. Moss. They had been working together for nearly 9 months now, and the sessions had evolved from crisis management to genuine personal development. Marcus told her about the panel and Jake's message. Dr. Moss smiled and asked him to reflect on how different his life was now compared to a year ago. Marcus thought about the question carefully before answering. A year ago, he had measured his worth entirely by external markers like wealth, status, and the fear he inspired in others. He had been lonely despite being surrounded by people, because none of his relationships had been based on genuine connection. He had been angry almost constantly, seeing threats and challenges everywhere, feeling like he had to prove himself in every interaction. He had been successful in business but miserable as a human being, though he wouldn't have admitted it at the time. Now, Marcus told Dr. Moss, he still had work to do but felt fundamentally different. He valued relationships based on mutual respect rather than dominance. He found satisfaction in helping others succeed rather than just promoting himself. He could handle criticism without becoming defensive, and could admit mistakes without feeling like his entire identity was under attack. Most importantly, he felt connected to something larger than himself through his work at the Veterans Center. Dr. Moss asked if he felt he had been punished enough for his actions that night at the restaurant. Marcus considered the question and realized it was the wrong framework. He hadn't been serving a sentence this whole time. He had been learning to be a better person. The embarrassment, the professional consequences, the hard work of therapy and volunteering, none of it had been punishment. It had all been education. Jake had given him an unintentional gift that night by showing him exactly how hollow his version of strength really was. As winter turned to spring, Marcus continued his volunteer work and slowly rebuilt his reputation in the community. The viral video was still out there on the internet, and occasionally someone would recognize him from it. But increasingly, people also recognized him from his work at the Veterans Center or from the Employment Fair panel. The narrative was shifting, not because Marcus had tried to erase his mistake, but because he had consistently demonstrated change over time. The dealership had recovered from the initial crisis. Sales were strong again, and employee morale had improved under David's more collaborative leadership style. Marcus remained involved, but had accepted that his role was different now. He focused on strategy and operations, contributing his skills without needing to be the face of every success. The board members, including Patricia, had acknowledged his growth and restored his full responsibilities, though Marcus chose not to exercise all of them. One Tuesday evening in early May, Marcus arrived at the Veterans Center for his regular volunteer shift and found Michael Torres talking with someone in the lobby. As Marcus got closer, his heart skipped a beat. He recognized the visitor immediately. It was Jake Sullivan. Jake turned and saw Marcus, and for a moment neither man moved. Then Jake extended his hand with a slight smile. Marcus shook Jake's hand, finding his voice after a moment of shock. He asked what brought Jake to San Diego. Jake explained that he had separated from active duty and was in the process of moving back to the area to be closer to family. He had reached out to Michael about volunteering at the center and had mentioned knowing Marcus. Michael, knowing their history, had suggested Jake come by when Marcus would be there. The two men talked for over an hour, far longer than Marcus's usual volunteer shift. They walked to a nearby coffee shop and sat outside in the mild evening air. Jake asked about Marcus's work at the center, and Marcus found himself opening up about how much it had changed him. He apologized again, more thoroughly than in his emails, for his behavior that night. Jake accepted the apology gracefully and said he could see that Marcus had done the work of actually changing, rather than just saying sorry. Jake shared some of his own struggles with transitioning out of military life. He talked about missing the sense of purpose and clear mission that military service provided. He mentioned that he had seen too many veterans struggle with civilian life because they hadn't found a new mission to replace the old one. That was why he wanted to volunteer at the center, to help others navigate what he was experiencing himself. Marcus asked Jake if he would be willing to co-teach some of the business workshops with him. Marcus could cover the practical business skills, but Jake could speak to the veteran experience in ways Marcus never could. Jake agreed immediately, saying he thought they would make a good team. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, that they would be working together after their confrontation less than a year ago. As they walked back to the parking lot, Jake stopped and turned to Marcus. He said that he wanted Marcus to know something important. That night at the restaurant, Jake had recognized that Marcus was dealing with his own issues, his own insecurities. Jake had served with men who acted tough to cover fear and self-doubt. The difference was that most of them had learned better in the military. Marcus had to learn the hard way in public with consequences. But he had learned, and that took a different kind of courage than most people had. Marcus felt emotion rising in his throat, but managed to thank Jake for those words. They exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet the following week to start planning their workshop collaboration. As Marcus drove home that night, he thought about the strange journey that had brought him to this point. A moment of drunken aggression had destroyed his reputation, humiliated him publicly, and forced him to confront who he really was underneath all the bravado and expensive possessions. But that same moment had also led him to therapy, to the Veterans Center, to meaningful work that actually helped people, and now to a partnership with the man he had foolishly threatened. Marcus wouldn't have chosen this path if someone had offered it to him a year ago. He would have insisted he was fine the way he was. But looking back now, he could see that he hadn't been fine at all. He had been successful but empty, powerful but weak in all the ways that actually mattered. The following months brought new challenges and continued growth. Marcus and Jake developed a strong working relationship at the Veterans Center, teaching workshops together and mentoring individual veterans. Their partnership became something of a local story, featured in a newspaper article about redemption and second chances. This time, Marcus didn't cringe at the public attention. The story was honest about his mistakes and focused on the work he was doing to make amends. Marcus also reconnected with some family members he had neglected during his years of focusing solely on business success. His sister, who he hadn't spoken to in over 2 years, reached out after seeing the newspaper article. They met for lunch, and Marcus found himself apologizing for years of missed birthdays and ignored phone calls. His sister listened and then asked if they could start over, build a real relationship based on who Marcus was now rather than